Happy Friday, everyone. Just out of curiosity, does it ruin the weekend knowing that you've got an exam coming up the following Monday? I'm sorry, I don't intend to ruin your weekend. It's just a scheduling thing. I suppose if you really wanted to, we could move the exam back to Wednesday and then have class on Friday. And there's always a trade-off, okay? There's always a trade-off. But yeah, I do what I can to accommodate, but I'm not always able to accommodate. So I was looking online earlier today, and I was on Facebook very quickly, and saw something that was just kind of ironic. So we've been talking a lot about AI this semester, and I know that you've got other courses that your instructors basically say do not use AI tools for any of the projects. It was kind of a complete reversal of fortune because one of the students, a student had posted her work and showed the instructor's grade, and then the student did really well in the assignment, got a 93 out of 100. But then the feedback, it was so obviously AI generated. And I'm like, how can we convince our students not to use AI when instructors are grading using AI? And so part of me was just deeply offended by that. And part of me was like, maybe I should consider doing that more frequently. But I don't know. I guess if I'm saying it's okay for students to use AI, then it's okay for me to grade AI. Is that all right? That's the trade-off? Yeah, all right. So these next exams will be graded using AI tools. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. AI can't replicate my train of thought. All right, let's get started. Let's talk about what's going to be on the exam. So real quick, this is an important concept that I want to make sure that we understand as we're going through the study guide. I tend to use the following two terms pretty thoroughly. I use or pretty frequently. I use the term identify, and then I use the term define. If I say identify, basically what that means is that if I provide you a contextual reference for that, if I provide context to something, you should be able to identify what I'm referring to. All right. I will not provide you any short answer questions with respect to identification. You will not have to answer in any detail. You may have to, like, I may provide a short answer question and say, what is this an example of? But again, it's a pure identification task. All right. So this is stuff that's not as relevant to what we were talking about. I didn't think it's a prominent as important. Define basically is kind of the whole gamut of knowledge. Everything that we've talked about, you need to be able to replicate that. So if I say you need to be able to define something, that means you have a lot more responsibility for those particular items. All right. So as we're going through this, and I'm not going to, as I do on all the study guides, I'm not going to go through everything. But if you see something that says identify, that's something you need to know, but you don't need to be able to provide a verbatim definition of it. Whereas if I say define, you should be able to replicate anything that I provided. Now, I say verbatim, as long as you're close and somewhere in the ballpark of whatever it is I provided, that's going to be good enough. I'm not looking for word for word definitions, but it does need to be consistent with what I provided when we talked about it in class. All right, breakdown for the exam. So there's 20 multiple choice questions. We covered 5 chapters, chapters 2, 3, 11, 12, and 15. With the exception of chapter 11, all of those chapters are going to have 3 multiple choice questions. Chapter 11 will only have 2 multiple choice questions. And if you remember, that was the chapter we did on Power BI and visualization. There was not a lot of content to that chapter. It was mostly just about the use of Power BI. So I limited the number of questions in there. And I think that was true for the practice exam as well. Excel and NetSuite will both have 3 questions apiece. So greater responsibility for those particular areas. But we'll talk a little bit about that more. There will be one problem with 6 parts, and that will cover all of the chapters. As well, I'm not going to say it will absolutely cover all chapters. It has the potential to cover all the chapters. Some of the things we've talked about in the chapters are more important than others. If you see me stop and say this will absolutely be on the exam, you should probably take note, okay? Because that's likely to be something that I'm going to include both as multiple choice section and in the problem section as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on the content. Like I said, not covering everything, just the things that I think need some clarification. If there's something that you do not understand that I do not cover in the walkthrough, please make sure you can stop me during the study guide and say, will this be covered, or what will you expect on this? Or we can talk about it at the end of the study guide. If you don't ask me this now, then, well, you still have the opportunity to ask me this over email over the weekend, but I'm not going to cover it in the class if it's not asked in this class. So what are the features of big data? So the 5 V's. So remember, we talked about the 5 V's. And I'm embarrassed because I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I guess I could probably pull up slides for that. So I guess it's good news also that I'm not the one taking the exam. So yeah. So remember, we talked about the 5 V's. volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and value. All of these are large or high, okay? I'm not going to specifically refer or identify that you or focus on the idea that you identify that this is huge instead of high. Just make sure that you know what the magnitude is. The only one that's a low magnitude is veracity. Why is that case? What does veracity mean again? Veracity means accuracy, and we know that data tends to have a lot of volatility, and so it can be woefully inaccurate. Actually, it probably would be more appropriate to say high volatility here, but that's not one of the V's they give in the 5 V's, sadly. You have to remember veracity, not volatility. All right. And then as far as that goes, make sure you understand not just the 5 V's, you know what the 5 V's are, but make sure that you can identify the direction on those. How are data analytics defined? So make sure you know the definition of data analytics. It's a pretty rote definition. I'm not going to ask you anything too profound on this. One thing that we're going to go talk a little bit more in detail about is the AMPS model. Okay, so remember the 4 steps of the AMPS model. There are a few things you need to know about this. First of all, you absolutely need to know what the 4 steps in the AMPS model are. Okay, so ask the question, master the data, perform the analysis, share the story. You notice I did that without looking at that. That's something I do know. I do remember. But you also need to know a few little intuitive details here. So first of all, 4 types of data questions in the master the data step. So this is a very small one, but please make sure you take a look at this. This is on the chapter 2 slides on slide number 12. So data accessibility, data reliability, data integrity, and data type. You don't need to memorize the definitions for each of these. They're fairly self-explanatory, but I would make sure that you have some familiarity with what are the items within the master of the data. All right, and then on that same master of the data, audit data standards, make sure you know the definition for audit data standards. As I talked about, these are not exclusive to external audits. They were just developed as part of external audits, but they can be used in other settings, okay? So make sure you understand the definition for that. Perform the analysis. What are the 4 types of analysis in each step? In this step, so this one's a big one because we spent several days talking about this. We actually talked about it during chapter 2 lecture. Then we did multiple analyses in our Excel assignments. So you can expect at least 2 questions on this, if not more, with respect to this. So just as a reminder, we have our historical analyses, which are descriptive and diagnostic. Descriptive says what happened. Diagnostic says why did it happen. Then we have our forward-looking ones, our future-looking ones, which are predictive and prescriptive. Predictive says what will happen, and then prescriptive says based on what we think will happen, what should we do? Very important to understand that. Very important to understand the context in which we use that. So not only do you need to know the definitions, but you need to be able to identify examples. Fortunately, we did multiple examples of each in class. We talked about multiple examples of each in class in our homework and also with our Excel activities. So you should have some exposure to that, and it should be pretty straightforward. All right, moving on to chapter 3. I'm just going to go ahead and bluntly say that these key types of visualizations that are listed here, I guess I have number 6 down here. So let me go ahead and there. All the key types of visualization, you need to know what the types of visualization are, and you need to know what type of data they represent, okay? In all likelihood, I will not ask you to list those out. I'm not going to ask you to define each one, but I would expect you, if I say, here's an example of categorical data, to be able to identify the best approach for this would be a bar chart, okay? So please make sure you're familiar with that. That's definitely going to be on the exam, so you need to be prepared to answer that. As far as Power BI, what are the 3 types of view in Power BI? What is the purpose of each? We had 3 views. We had the report, the table, and the model view. The report view is the actual visualization creation view itself. That's where we create the visualizations to start with. The table view is where we would see the data as it would appear if we put it in Excel or in Access, and we can manipulate the data to some degree in that. And then the model view is where we define the relationships between the different data in the different tables. And if we have a good set of robust data, Power BI should be able to do that for us, as we were able to do in our examples. So that's what we want to look for in something like that. So make sure you're familiar with all those. Moving on to chapter 11. Okay, chapter 11 was all about controls, which, what do we know about internal controls in Dr. Barnes? Internal controls is one of my favorite things. Okay, so you can absolutely expect to be some fun questions on this one right here. All right. All right, so how is internal control defined? Remember, control is just a response to a risk. Then we need to basically know that. We talked about that the entire semester. Moving on, 3 categories of internal controls. Be able to identify and define each category, provide examples of each. This is pretty straightforward because we've talked about this since exam number 1, and we repeated it multiple times. 3 categories of controls: preventive, detective, and corrective. All right. So what is an example of preventive control? Segregation of duties. What's an example of a detective control? That would be a system that does an audit or puts an audit trail and identifies any anomalies, and corrective control would be fixing the problem. That's basically all there is. Just as a reminder, preventive is usually used in isolation. Detective and corrective are usually used jointly. Not always, but usually. Okay. What are the 2 categories of IT systems controls? This is an old one too that we've already talked about. So in the chapters in this section, we talked about them as general controls, but previously we talked about them and referred to them as access controls. They're the same things. Those terms can be used interchangeably. I honestly don't care which one you use if you had to define those on the exam. General and access controls are the same thing. What is the one word we always look for when we talk about general or access controls? That's employee, okay? And usually it's going to be a user of some type, but employee is usually the key term that I will use to try to guide you in that direction. Whereas if we're talking about application controls are about the system's activity. And so we're looking for the term system. Also, as a reminder, this is about true 80% of the time. General and access controls tend to be preventive in nature, whereas application controls tend to be detective and corrective in nature. Not always, but usually, okay? Usually that's how we can set those out. Okay, so 3 primary information technology IT governance frameworks. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about that. In fact, we started running out of time during the lecture, if I remember correctly. Please make sure you review those. We had 3 that we talked about and discussed. COBIT, ITIL, and ISO 27000 series. All your responsibility is here is that you need to be able to define the broad objectives. I'm not going to ask you detailed questions because we didn't have any detailed questions on these. So make sure you understand what each of these frameworks is intended to address. That's your responsibility for those. All right, everybody see this right here? If you're on the computer, if you're working on this own, highlight this in red or something like that, or put exclamation points on it, or make it bold or something like that. This, first of all, will absolutely be on the exam. Secondly, it's probably my favorite thing to talk about in all of accounting ever. Thirdly, I think it's extremely important, okay? It does not matter how much I've emphasized this in the past, students have still undervisited this, okay? They still have not focused on this. I'm going to tell you, hands down, 100%, this will be on the exam, okay? If you're going to spend a great amount of time focusing on anything, you should focus on this because there will be multiple questions covering this topics, okay? It's really, really important, okay? The 3 objectives are pretty straightforward. Make sure you can define those 3 objectives, or at least you can tell me what the 3 objectives are, okay? So we're going to actually, I think we have a question on that coming up, but make sure you understand what the 3 objectives are. It does not need to be detailed. You do not need to go through all of the wording. It was basically broadly defined as reporting, operations, and compliance. Controls are going to be in one of 3 areas. They're going to relate to the reliability of financial reporting, the efficiency and effectiveness of operations, or the firm's adherence to compliance with existing laws and regulations. All you really need to remember is reporting, operations, compliance, and understand what those terms mean, okay? The 5 components of COSO, there were some questions on that in the practice exam. Hopefully you remembered those, but remember, we had 5 components. Remember, I asked it in class and I said, what are the 5 components? And everybody kind of looked at me and said, we're not sure yet. If you're not sure now, it's time to get sure, okay? So what are those 5 components? The one that's the most important, the very first one that sets the stage for all the other components. What's that one called? Control environment. Very good. Then we talk about the entity making sure that they understand what threats are present in the organization. What is that called? Entities risk assessment. Yes. Then once we identify the risk, we create the controls. What's that called? Control activities. Yes. Then once we've created the controls, we have to make sure that people understand what their responsibilities for the controls are. What's that called? Information and communication. And then when risks change over time, we have to make sure we update controls to address those risks. What's that called? Monitoring. So that's the level of detail I want you to know what I just went through. If you want to go and watch this video and get the transcript and verbatim know or exactly go through what I just said, that would be a fine approach. You may not want to include all of my stutters, uhs, and ums, okay? Dr. Otero still gives me grief about the fact that I have vocalized pauses when I present. It's probably come from talking way too fast. I'm going to slow down a little bit, but I get really excited when I talk about controls, which is why I talk so fast. So please make sure you know this information. All right, chapter 12. So what is the CIA triad? Does anybody remember the 3 words in the CIA triad? This is the 3 components that have to exist in order to make sure that information system is secure. Has to be The information has to be confidential. We have to have integrity of information, and it has to be available. So confidentiality, integrity, availability. Those are the three components of the CIA triad. As far as examples of external threats of cyber attacks the information systems face, there was a big long list on the slides of this. You do not need to know every single one of these. I'm not going to ask you to list those out, but you might want to revisit the discussion that we had over a few of those because some of them are more prevalent. I did talk about social engineering. I talked a little bit about data breaches, and I specifically talked about ransomware. Was there a big reason why I talked about ransomware for this classroom? Yes, because Truman State suffered a ransomware attack 2 years ago. Okay, technically it's like 2 years and a few months ago, but it was actually in this classroom when I found out about it. So it was kind of eerie now that I'm talking about it. Anyway, make sure you understand what those types of attacks represent. What are the respective goals of encryption and authentication? So please make sure you can define both encryption and authentication. Those were given in the slides. And then symmetric key versus asymmetric key encryption. So be able to define each type of encryption and explain how each type of encryption works. That's a little bit of a misnomer. I'm not going to ask for technical definitions. I would expect you to understand the difference between the usage of symmetric key encryption and asymmetric key encryption. For example, one of the big appeals of symmetric key encryption is it's faster and it can be used for large data sets, but it can only generally be used for internal communications only, so organizational communications. Asymmetric is more for external with trading partners, but it is slower and can only operate on smaller data sets. More specifically, remember we had 2 slides on this, okay? So the example, so I kind of made the analogy to the padlock saying that you have to use the same key regardless of where you're encrypting or decrypting. Whereas asymmetric key, it's encrypted using a public key and decrypted using a private key, which is a little bit like an ATM card. I will admit those are not perfect analogies, but I think they're appropriate analogies given what our level of exposure to this information is. So please make sure you remember that. Let's see. Make sure that you take a look at the information about hashing and digital signatures. I'm not going to ask really complex questions about this because we're not focused too much about this. But I did talk a little bit. Oops, I'm in the wrong slides. That's why I'm not finding the information I'm looking for. So yeah. So we had a slide where we talked a little bit about hashing and what the definitions of it were. And so there's a little bit more about that. So yeah, make sure you review the slides in this area. Just make sure that you cover it because there's a likelihood that it's going to be on the exam. So as everybody should know, I am a former forensic accountant, so I love talking about fraud. And we did talk about fraud in this chapter. So I did say, what are the components of the fraud triangle? So, oops, I'm just randomly opening things now. Okay. That's what happens when you get older. So what are the components of the fraud triangle? Please make sure you can identify and define each component and provide examples of each. All right. If you want to do a classroom context, that is absolutely fine because I do consider cheating to be a form of fraud. I know that's probably a little bit profound. It's like, well, Dr. Barnes, if I've used an AI tool, are you saying that I'm committing fraud? And I'm saying, yes. No, it's fine. But I do think that's an appropriate way to think about fraud from your own perspective. Okay. So we're talking about 3 components. We have the incentive or pressure, we have the opportunity, and we have the attitude or rationalization. If you want to do pressure, opportunity, rationalization, or incentive, opportunity, attitude, whatever words you want to use, it's fine as long as they're consistent, okay? Then let's see. What are some examples of controls, corrective controls, preventive controls and corrective controls related to system availability? This was in the last slide for chapter 12. It was kind of an afterthought, but I do think it's important to make sure that you do that. We actually had a homework assignment where we talked about each of these. So please make sure that you know what each of these represent so you can actually define each of these. And actually, definition is probably a little too much. If I gave you a definition of each, you should be able to identify it. I don't think I'm going to have you define each of these. But I do think that you should be able to know whether it's preventive or corrective and probably be able to tell me why that's the case. Okay, so please make sure you're aware of that. All right. Now, chapter 15. Seems like we just went over that. So what are the primary goals in a blockchain systems? So this is the slide, the introductory slide, which kind of gave the overview of blockchain systems. This framed the rest of our discussion, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about the contents of this slide. So if you took diligent notes, you should have all of this. If you didn't, go back and watch the video, make sure to discuss it. When I say something like why online is good, why peer-to-peer is good, why trustless is good. When we see the word trustless, we think, oh, there's no trust. That's a bad thing. That's completely and totally not correct. Trustless is a good thing because that means we don't have to trust a third party in our transactions. At least that was the intuition behind early blockchain systems. Is that the way it works in the real world nowadays? Sadly, no. Sadly, no. There's actually being trust is just being imposed on a less regulated party. Remember, we talked about crypto asset traders and how they're not nearly as well regulated as banks, but we've just basically put our trust in a different party now. So trust now still exists. It's just a little bit less well placed. That's Dr. Barnes in his boomer era of talking about crypto assets. And so, yeah, so I guess now technically I'm both an Excel boomer and a crypto boomer. I apologize, guys. I apologize. I'm trying to avoid being a boomer, and that's where I'm at. All right. Remember the four blockchain systems? We talked about the four types of blockchain systems. So please make sure that you can identify and define each type of blockchain system. This is not a difficult task. They are fairly intuitive based on the name. So if you remember the names, you should be able to identify. I do think that diagram that I provided that showed you kind of the overlap, the Venn diagram overlap, is pretty effective in that regard, because public was identified as a permissionless process, whereas permission to process, we're going to be private and consortium. And then the overlap is the hybrid blockchain. So make sure you understand all of those. Machine learning. So make sure you can identify and define machine learning, deep learning, and neural networks. Neural networks, to a lesser extent, you only need to know neural networks as it applies to deep learning, because that's how we define deep learning. Basically, remember, deep learning is probably the most complex form of machine learning, and it's basically trying to emulate the way human neural pathways are developed. So that's why we say use the term neural networks. What are the types of machine learning? So the two different types of tasks that machine learning systems are designed to perform. This one's pretty basic. It's classification and regression. Make sure you know those and you understand the basic definitions. This does not need to be a verbatim definition, but they have to at least be somewhat consistent with the way that I've taught them in this course. Okay. And the four types of machine learning, make a star, make a notation of this. Let's see, if this up here was red, what is this down here? We're going to make this a nice purple. Okay. We're going to make this a nice purple. And so if purple's available, yeah, we're going to make that a purple. So very important, maybe not as important as what we talked about with respect to the COSA framework. Okay. But please make sure you're familiar with that, the four types of machine learning. So remember, we have supervised learning, which is known inputs, known outputs, unsupervised learning, known inputs only, semi-supervised learning, the input data labels are missing, and then reinforcement learning, which has 3 words. What are the 3 words? Trial and error. Yep, trial and error. Yeah. And we went to a lot more depth than that, but that's basically where we're at. Okay. Excel activities in class. All right, what have I said with respect to the functions that we learned in this section? I've said this in the first exam. I've said it multiple times after the second exam. What is your responsibility with respect to the functions? To know the components of the functions, all right? I know that's an unreasonable request because you would be able to look at the components of the functions if you're using an Excel spreadsheet. But the good news is that this is not a democracy, it's a dictatorship. So I get to make the rules here. Well, at least for the next few weeks anyway. After that, whatever. But yeah, you do need to know the components of the functions if it's a function that we covered in the second half of the exam, okay? Which they're listed here. I'm going to throw this out here. I already told you it was going to be on there. I'm going to stress this again. There will be a question on the index match series. Okay, so that's 2 functions, but they're going to be used jointly together. The question will have an index match function and ask you to identify something about it. Okay, so please make sure you're familiar with it. It will not be an index match function. I will not do that to you. That's just unfair. But you are required to understand the index match function. So if you come to Sunday night and you're still studying and you're just like, I don't understand this index match function, you can either do one of 2 things. Punt the question and accept that you're going to miss 3 points on the exam. Okay. Or you can come talk to me and say, I don't understand this. Can you explain this in detail? I would do that after you've actually watched the video going through the explanation again, because I do think I cover it pretty thoroughly during Excel activity. But there is going to be definitely a question. It's a multiple choice question that you will have to answer. Historically speaking, when I've asked questions of this type, students have not done well. So I'm giving you all the notice that I can tell you that there will be a question on the index match, okay? There will also be 2 other Excel questions. Please make sure that you spend sufficient time on this. This is not a big part of the exam. It's only 9 points in aggregate, but that is enough to drop you a letter grade if you don't take it seriously. Speaking of taking things seriously, there's NetSuite assignments. A lot of these are asking processes, okay? The good news is if you just reflect upon your NetSuite assignment that you had to submit in class today that was due today, most of the processes should be fairly apparent now because you've had to repeat them 2 times, okay? You did them one time when we went through them in class, and you did them again as part of your NetSuite 8 assignments. So you should be pretty familiar with the processes, how they work, okay? I'm not going to ask you really, really detailed knowledge, like saying, what did we have to put in this cell? What were those exact words, okay? but I will ask you some process details that should be fairly apparent. I may ask you like which I'm following a transaction line. What is the next step that I would do? That was consistent with what I did on the first exam. I may ask the same thing. For some specific information, so there's some questions on here that are a little bit more specific. Why was the default and bill of advance of receipt removed? So remember, we started going to account preferences and setup, and we or set up in account preferences, and I said, let's go ahead and take a look at this. And then I said, is this checked? And it says, no. Why is it not checked? And why is it important that it's not checked? Does everybody remember that? I know this was before the first exam, but I've referred to it multiple times in the class. So if we had that box checked, it would basically say vendors could send invoices to us before they'd actually delivered any merchandise, which we don't want them doing. Okay, so that was the reason for that. Literally a similar logic for this default sales order status changed to pending approval. It wasn't actually changed. It was already set at pending approval, but you had the possibility of pending approval or pending fulfillment. So if we're saying it's pending approval, that means anytime a sales order is created, it has to be approved by an external supervisor. If it's pending fulfillment, that means that it basically, once it's created, immediately goes to be fulfilled. It goes to it basically goes to be sent out. So that's when it goes to the warehouse and they pick, pack, and ship it. Is there a situation where we might prefer pending fulfillment over pending approval? Yes, if we have lots of really small transactions that they don't all require approvals. So if we're talking about a large, small transactions, that we might want to go for pending fulfillment. But in our situation, we said every single transaction, revenue transaction, should be approved before sending out to be fulfilled. Remember, we talked about the process for approving a sales order. That's pretty straightforward, but we also had to go through the customer information should be reviewed. What were the two pieces of information we looked at? We looked at the customer's existing balance to make sure that it does not exceed what their approved credit limit was. And we looked at the days past due. In our particular example, 10 Xena Systems, that was their, I remember the number, and Xena Systems, they had no outstanding balance, they had no overdue items, so they were fine, okay? But that's not going to always be true for every customer. We want to make sure that any customer that tries to do business with us, that they're paying us off on a consistent basis. And then three-way match. So we talked about this at the end. We talked about the three-way match. I did make a reference to saying the three-way match can exist both in the purchasing and in the revenue process. And this is basically comparing documents to make sure that there's a redundant series of information, that all the information is consistent across all the documentation. Now, in the real world, matching systems for documents can actually be 3, 4, 5-way matches, and they can exist both in the purchasing process and in the revenue process. But for this specific instance, I said we are going to match the following 3 documents, and you need to remember that those 3 documents were going to be the invoice, okay, because that's the one that we actually talked about in the revenue process. That's where we started talking about this. And we made sure the information in the customer invoice, well, I shouldn't say invoice, shouldn't say it's an invoice that goes to the customer, but it's not generated by the customer. So the invoice, the sales invoice, was consistent with the customer's purchase order that they sent us and the sales order that was generated as a result of the purchase order. So remember, customer sent us a purchase order. Internally, we create a sales order with the information on the purchase order in it. And then we match those 2 documents to make sure that they're consistent with the invoice that we're going to send to the customer. All right. So it's important to remember that was the 3-way match we talked about. Can a matching process be used with other documentation? Absolutely. But that was the one that we looked at for NetSuite. So please make sure you're familiar with those documents. All right. That does it with the study guide. Are there any questions or anything that we need to cover that was not covered? All right. Let's talk about the exam then. The practice exam. Sorry, I don't have the real exam up for you. It's just unfortunate. It'd be a much easier exam if I just gave you the answers in advance, right? All right. All right, data analytics professionals estimate they spend how much of their time cleaning data in order to perform analysis on it. So was this a number that was a larger number or a smaller number? It was a larger number. It was a larger number, a very, very large number. It's 50 to 90%. And remember, I said in class, because I used to do data analysis, that usually goes on to larger end. But you do need to know the range, 50 to 90%. Which of the following is not part of the AMPS model? So we got AMPS. So they're all parts of the AMPS model, right? Just circle all 4 answers, correct? Yep. Nope. I remember I told you do need to know all 4 parts. So ask the question, is that one of them? Yep. Master the data, is that one of them? Parse the data, is that correct? No, that should be perform the analysis, and share the story is also one of them. What type of data analysis is used to determine if something will happen in the future? Okay, so remember I said these questions would be on the exam. Here's an example of these. So let's make sure we have our definitions in place. Descriptive, what happened? Diagnostic, why did something happen? Predictive, what will happen? Prescriptive, based on what we think will happen, what should we do? That's what you need to know because they'll make these questions very easy. So this is going to be one example of a type of question I ask. This is an easy one. What will happen in the future? That's a predictive analysis. That's a predictive analysis. Which statement best describes data visualization? This is a basic definition question, and I'm not going to make anything too confusing on this. I just want to make sure that you understand the concept, okay? So data visualization is the process of presenting information through images. We talked about the reason behind that is that most people are visual thinkers. They look at something and they absorb it 600 times more readily than if they look at it in words. And that's one big reason why I think teaching is an important art, because if we just tried to teach by saying, read this, then we'll talk about it in class, most students will get very frustrated just trying to read technical information. It's also why I develop a lot of memes in my presentations, because that's something, it seems kind of funny. So like Dr. Barnes wants to be a stand-up comedian. That's true, but it also reinforces really, really difficult concepts through a mechanism that's easy to absorb. So that's kind of the idea behind visualization. Just some tips for you guys if you ever have to do presentations in the future, which I'm guessing most of you in this room will. Before preparing a visualization in Power BI, user must verify the associations that exist in the data in the tables between being used in the visualization. What view in Power BI is used for this task? So first of all, you need to know what the views are. Classification is not one of the views, by the way. I just put that in there. I thought about putting the query view on there, but I thought that might get a little confusing. It is one of the views in there, but remember that was the language, the underlying language task. Sorry. So we have the table, model, or report view. Okay. So this is saying we have to verify the associations or the relationships that exist. So what are we going to use for that? Table is basically we'll review the data as it would appear in Excel or Access. So that's where we can manipulate the data, but we're not manipulating any associations. So it's not table view. The report view, that's where we actually create the visualizations themselves, which means that we have to create the relationships before we can do anything. Must be the model view. The model view is the relationship view. Okay. In fact, in early versions of Power BI, it used to be called the relationship view. So interesting little fact. Reconciliation of cash accounts may be referred to as what type of cash control? Okay, so this is going to be the different types of controls. Adjustive controls isn't a thing. That's one thing I threw on there. I thought about doing all of the above, but that would not make any sense. So I decided to throw in there just to make sure you know. Sounds like a good control, though. Is it corrective, detective, or preventive? Well, let's just go ahead and go in order. All right. So preventive control, that's trying to prevent a problem from occurring. Would a reconciliation prevent bad things from occurring? No, reconciliation doesn't stop anything. It's trying to actually look and see, is the information in our bank account correct? If we identify something, then we're going to subsequently correct it. So it can't be a corrective control. It must be a detective control. All right. By the way, with respect to the questions like this, if you've memorized the examples that we talked about in class, good for you. Okay. I think that's an appropriate approach. If you come up on this, a question like this, and you're saying, I don't remember which one this category this falls in, take a moment and think about the nature of the activity that we're talking about. You probably are familiar with reconciliations to at least some degree, even if you've never performed a bank reconciliation. What is the purpose of that? It's to validate that the balance that's in the bank account is consistent with the balance in the book account. If it's not, then we have a problem. So that's probably trying to detect a problem. That's an easy way to approach this particular question. I say easy as somebody who's been doing accounting for 30 years. So yeah. If you've been doing it for accounting for 30 years, very easy, very easy. If you've been doing it for one semester, maybe not so much. All right. A computerized environment, internal controls can be categorized in which of the following? So we have two categories. We're talking about a computerized or an IT environment. So these are our IT controls. We talked about access and application controls, but what's another word for access? General controls. So general controls and application controls. Said I would use them interchangeably and that I could use them. So I do expect you to know both. Fill in the blank. Something is characterized by actions and attitudes of the individuals who lead the organization. So it looks like we've got the components of our internal control integrated framework. By the way, this is the only question on the exam, on the practice exam in this area. I don't want to understate this because I stated it will be a much more prominent part of the actual exam. Okay, so please be aware that even though this is the only part of the components that were on this exam or the practice exam, it will be a much bigger part of the actual exam itself. So don't make sure you spend enough sufficient time studying this. But if you didn't struggle with this question, you're on the right track. So the individuals that lead the organization, they have to take control seriously. If I don't take controls over the exam on Monday seriously, people might cheat. So I have to say, look, I want you to do well in the exam, but I also want you to understand that you have to do this through your own efforts. Okay. If you turn on your computer in front of you and have all the information listed, well, first of all, that's just silly. I'm going to see it. Okay. But if you try to cheat me another way and I find out about it, that will be considered academic misconduct, and you will get a 0 on the exam, and it will go into your permanent file. And usually, that's enough for students to say, okay, it's not worth cheating. But I'm telling you that I'm taking cheating seriously. I'm setting the tone at the top. What is that called? The control environment. The control environment. It's the most important component. If I don't set the tone, then it doesn't matter what else I do. Nobody will take it seriously. If I'm just kind of like saying, do whatever you want. Okay, bring notes with you. I don't get. Don't do that. Okay, that is considered cheating. Okay, I do take academic conduct very seriously, or academic misconduct, the lack thereof. Asymmetric key encryption uses which of the following techniques to allow computers to communicate securely. This one is not one of those ones that you need to know each one of these items, but I wanted you to be able to identify what is the relevant relationship for asymmetric key encryption. So if it's a message digest, basically that's just an aggregation of digital signatures. We didn't talk about that with respect to asymmetric key encryption. A 16-bit encryption key, we did talk about encryption keys, but what is the minimum level of encryption that's required for asymmetric key encryption in today's day and age? It's 128 bits, okay? Most of them are actually at 256 bits nowadays, okay? Digital signatures, that does relate to asymmetric key encryption, but that's in a further use that's going to use for identification or validation, which both includes encryption and hashing, okay? So that would use both of these. What we're talking about specifically, techniques to communicate securely, are a public key and a private key. That was something that was very specifically related to asymmetric key encryption, and that's our answer there. All right. Speaking of hashing, it's an information security procedure that utilizes an algorithm to ensure that receive files are identical to content of what was set. That's how we defined hashing, okay? So would I ask you to redefine this? No, but do I actually ask you to be able to identify if I give you the definition? Absolutely, and this is a perfect example of that. All right. Cressy's hypothesis states trusted persons become trust violators when they conceive of themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable, okay? So say, for example, that you spent a lot of money on, what would be an example? AYCD last night. Okay, so that's a good example. That's an easy way to, everybody's like, he's heard of AYCD? Yes, I've been here a while, okay? Yeah, I actually give my graduate students a lot of grief whenever they're just really slow on Friday mornings. So, did you guys have too much AYCD last night? And so, yeah. Yeah. Does everybody know what that means, by the way, when I say that? I realize we're in a junior class, and so some of you may not have had the privilege of enjoying AYCD at Duke. All you can drink, okay? It's both a privilege and a curse, okay? It's both privilege and a curse. As somebody who's indulged in my younger years, no longer though. So you spent too much money on that last night, and then you came up and you said, all right, I don't have enough money to buy lunch today. I know that's a silly situation. Probably you just skip lunch. But you see Dr. Barnes' wallet hanging out. It's like, boy, that guy is flush. He's got loaded cash. He probably won't notice if I steal $20 from it. Okay. So that's basically something you're really, really hungry. That sure sounds like a pressure, okay, or an incentive to do something. And that, in fact, is what we're talking about here. Remember, we talked about this in class. We underlined 3 different parts, the 3 components of the fraud triangle. Please make sure you review those. Those are going to be how I frame this for the exam. Which of the following is a key benefit of blockchain system? Okay, so what about asynchronous update? What do you guys think about that? So we're close, but we have to eliminate the letter A. It is synchronous updating. Asynchronous means that we would do it at a later point in time and not consistent with the systems. It's supposed to be a synchronous updating system, okay? Is there a single copy of the general ledger? No, there's multiple copies of the ledger. That's why blockchain is so beneficial, okay? So we got 2 off of these. So it can't be D, it must be B. Full transparency of the system. That was a primary feature of blockchain systems. And one thing we talked about important, remember in accounting and business, transparency is our friend. We like things that are transparent. Maybe not perfectly transparent because that would give away competitive advantages, but we do like transparency. All right. Company and suppliers agree to set up secure blockchain between them, facilitate purchase and returns transactions. Which is the type of blockchain to be used in this situation? 2 pieces of information that are relevant. I don't know why I held up the thing 1 finger. 2 pieces of information that are relevant. Okay, a company has key suppliers, so that means an aggregate or a group of parties. Secondly, set up a secure blockchain, which means that they're permission to process. Those 2 features are the features of a consortium blockchain. Okay. The bank has an external list of customer credit scores on hand. The bank uses machine learning techniques to develop its own credit ratings for each customers, which it compares to the external list. Which type of machine learning is the bank using? So this one's an interesting one because it basically says we have pieces of input. We're trying to generate and match outputs that we already know exist. So they have a known input and a known output, which means that this is going to be supervised learning technique, a supervised learning technique. If we did not have an output, then it would be unsupervised, or if we had missing data labels. There's no mention of trial error here, so it's pretty easy, a supervised learning one there. All right, moving on to our Excel data analysis. So our data analytics from chapter 10, I don't know why it says chapter 10, it's actually chapter 2. My apologies. Created a pivot table summarizing the set of journal entries to determine why transactions are being entered or approved by the same person. What type of data analysis did that activity represent? This was our second activity. And remember, we talked about this. We said we want to identify violations of segregation duties so we can figure out why did this happen. So the word why is really, really important. Okay, the word why is really important here. We're asking why. We're talking about a diagnostic analysis. A diagnostic analysis. For one of Excel activities, we briefly explored a newer function in Excel, XLOOKUP, which the following describes one of the differences between VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. It says, Dr. Barnes, why are you teaching us about VLOOKUP? That's a boomer Excel. Because I'm the instructor, I get to do what I want, okay? But I do think this is a critical one to understand because XLOOKUP has some very big advantages over VLOOKUPs. One of those advantages is presented here. So VLOOKUP requires the user to specify an array or range of cells for the VLOOKUP, or XLOOKUP, you kind of use arrays or columns for the search range. That's unfortunately not true, okay? It's actually the other way around. XLOOKUP requires an array. VLOOKUP or can use arrays or columns. On C, VLOOKUP will only return exact matches in your search, where XLOOKUP will defaults to finding appropriate proximate matches unless you specify otherwise. Again, we transpose those. XLOOKUPs will return exact matches. VLOOKUPs only approximate matches. So the one that must be true is B. VLOOKUP can only index on both based on only vertically presented data, where XLOOKUP can index on both vertically and horizontally. That is a true statement, and that's one of the big appeals of XLOOKUP, is that it can basically serve as both an VLOOKUP and an HLOOKUP. Hopefully you enjoyed this one here, right here, okay? So what are the results of the formula entered in C1? So we have a mid-length embedded function. So we talked about mid. We start here with A1. We go to the length of however long this is plus 1. So we go Excel, 5, and then 6. We start at 6, and then we go for 10 spaces, which the 10 is just an arbitrary length, okay? Some length that actually captures this. What's going to capture is what's after the 7th character, sorry, the 6th character, which is rules, D, okay? That was the example we walked through in class, and that was what you should have remembered on that. All right, NetSuite questions. One of the first tasks we performed in NetSuite as part of the purchasing process was to examine the defaults in the accounting preferences. What was the purpose of this action? So remember, the defaults in the purchasing process had to make sure that we were making sure that the vendors the vendors could not send in invoices before they had actually sent the merchandise. So they could remember there was the bill in advance of receipt box. We had to make sure that was unchecked. If it was checked, basically the vendors could send in invoices at any point during the purchasing process. This restricts them to only sending receipt or invoices after the receipt of goods. So B is our answer. Final step of the purchasing process we had is to issue payment to the vendor in the NetSuite. Which account do we use to make this payment? Okay, so we think about this. Where do we issue the payment from? It's probably a cash account, right? That's where we usually issue payment from in an accounting transaction. What was the nature of the cash account that we talked about in NetSuite? What was that called? Not everybody at once. I'm getting overwhelmed. It's checking, the checking account. We had 2 different checking accounts that we had to specify. This one was the purchasing checking account. We had a separate one for revenue checking account. All right, refer to the following transaction areas in the NetSuite revenue process. Now, I asked this very easy. I just I gave you the correct one, and then I randomized all the other ones. I just randomized. I won't necessarily do that if I ask a question similar to those exams, so you do need to know the order of these. So let's walk through the orders. Intuitively speaking, if we're talking about revenue process, we need to receive a purchase order from the customer first, but that's not listed up here. We're assuming that's probably the first step. The next step in sequence would be entering sales orders, because that's what we use to generate, or that's what purchase orders are generated from. Once we enter the sales orders, we have to approve it. That was one of our requirements that we talked about. Once the sales orders are approved, then it's fulfilled. Once it's fulfilled, we send the invoice to the customer, and then the customer sends us payment. So 32451, 32451 is A. The good news is on this one, you only had to know what the first step of the sequence was, and you got this one correct, but I may not be so kind on the exam itself. All right, let's go ahead and move over to the practice exam key so we can see what the answers are. By the way, the key is now available online if you want to look at this. Obviously, the key probably also has that that typo where I said chapter 10 instead of chapter 2. I'll have to fix that at some point in the future. Big data is characterized by 5 V's. You need to know what the 5 V's were, and you needed to make sure that you understood what their direction was, or the descriptors. So huge volume, which you could set high volume, that's fine. They're the same thing. High velocity, high variety, low veracity, high value. Now, could I ask you about veracity? What does veracity mean again? Accuracy, and it's low accuracy. So we're basically saying that the information or data that's available out there is not necessarily always accurate or consistent with one another. All right. Key steps in the data analytics process referred to as ETL. What does ETL stand for? What an easy question. ETL. Extract, transform, and load. I like to call this data cleaning and data validation, but this is a much more appropriate term. So you need to know each of those items, what those represent. Okay. So listed below are some examples of different categories for different information that might be developed as a result of data analytics. For each example, identify which, not with, which type of visualization would be the most appropriate for the information presented. So demographic information for students based on classification. By the way, if I ask you a similar question like this on the exam, I will be very, very sure that you're familiar with what the category is. Okay, so I'm going to have some sort of reference in there that talks about it. So if you just tried to identify based on the description, it may be a little bit muddled, but I did specify this is categorical information. Categorical information was the first one we talked about. What was the first type of chart we talked about? Bar charts, vertical or horizontal bar charts are fine. Okay. Then geographic location of students prior to attending Truman State, which is geospatial. That's pretty obvious. That should be a map, okay? That would be a map or a symbol map. And percentage of students in each major at Truman State, which is a proportional representation. Proportional representation, they're food charts, pie or donut charts, whichever one you prefer, pie or donut charts, okay? Need to know. By the way, if you just answered one or more of these, or if you answered shorthand, like I said, bar charts here, that's perfectly fine, okay? I'm not looking for a whole level of complexity. The more you answer, that's great. The more specific you are, but I'm not going to be too restrictive on this. What are two types of tasks that machine learning is designed to perform? Provide a brief definition for each type of task. So what are they again? Classification and regression. So remember, classification is basically answering whether a condition exists, a yes, no. Okay. Regression is trying to determine an actual value for something. So seeking to assign labels, dividing input to output groups, and seeking to predict real numbers, again, does not need to be verbatim as long as you get somewhere in the ballpark of what I'm looking for. And then our final questions. What are the three information or IT governance frameworks that we examine in this course? Define the role of each framework. So our first one is COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. Okay, question always comes up. Do we need to have the actual words here? Will you ask about the actual words? No. Knowing the letters is sufficient. COBIT, ITIL, and ISO 27000 series. If you want to show off your knowledge and say, hey, look at this, I know all of this, that's great. No extra points on that. But I will say very impressive. Okay, I do appreciate the extra work, but I don't think that's important. What is important is being able to define what each framework deals with. So remember, COBIT is a very broad. It deals with IT governance and management. So it's very, very broad in its scope. It covers kind of the big picture view. Then we have ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It's about IT service management, basically how we can actually turn our IT services into profit, how we can actually generate value through those. And then ISO 27000 series. The ISO 27000 series is the establishment and maintenance of an information security management system, an ISMS, Information Security Management System. Last question is pretty straightforward. What's in the CIA triad? Okay. What are the three objectives? I didn't tell you it was CIA triad. I said blank, blank, blank triad, and you should remember CIA. Confidentiality, availability, integrity, availability. Those terms are fairly self-explanatory, but I would make sure that you have at least some knowledge of what those represent with respect to information security, because we did talk about that in class. All right. That does it. Best of luck in your studies this weekend. If you have any important questions, feel free to email me. I'll see you all on Monday.